located on the distal epiphysis? Which of these features of the ulna are located on the distal epiphysis? A, styloid process, B, head, C, both, D, neither. So which are on the distal epiphysis? A, styloid process, B, head, C, both of them, D, neither.
Both.
Yeah. There's only two features on the distal epiphysis. The head, which we did as articular, which is this disc, and then the pointed feature, little sharp pointed features are usually called styloid process, and they're never articular. Heads are always articular, styloids never articular. So those are it's muscle attachment. So those are the two features of the distal epiphysis. Okay, so then I'll go to radius, and the radius has three articular features similar. One of them has two articulations, and I'll spend time because that's always a test question. The head of the radius is articular, but it's got two articulations. And then the distal concave articular surface, other teachers might call that something else, but it's not going to be a test issue. The distal radius, whatever you want to call it, is articular. This distal, it's actually a concave articular surface, forms the wrist joint, that's articular. And the tricky one is the ulnar notch of the radius, because that's what spins around or pivots around the head of the ulna. So the three articular features of the radius are the head, the distal surface for the wrist, and the ulnar notch, which is a lot like the fibular notch. It's not like the fibular notch when we get there in a little bit. So the ulnar notch of the radius, all these notches on radius and ulna are named after the bone they articulate with. All the notches on the radius and ulna are named after the other bone. But I'll do the head because the head articulates with the capitulum, head of radius to capitulum of humerus, that's part of elbow. So the head articulates head of radius with capitulum of humerus, that's the elbow joint still. But there is a giant joint capsule that envelops both the elbow joint and the proximal radial ulnar joint. That's why a feature can be in two joints. You have a giant joint capsule that covers both of them. So the head of the radius also articulates with the radial notch of the ulna. Head of radius also articulates with radial notch of the ulna, and that's the proximal radial ulnar joint. We did it from the ulnar point of view a couple of minutes ago. But the head of the radius with the capitulum forms the part of the elbow, but the head of the radius also articulates with the radial notch of the ulna, and that's the proximal radial ulnar joint, that's pivot. So those are it's one feature, but it forms two joints, and I'm sure you've had a question dealing with that. So just know, I've seen it on the final at times, that they say what the head of the radius articulates with, and it's usually a combo answer. Capitulum is one answer, and radial notch of ulna is the other answer. It's usually a combo type of answer. The other features, I'll do this distal concave articular surface. They're probably just going to say the distal radius articulates with first three carpals. No, that's always on the test. So the distal concave, or just distal surface of radius, articulates with scaphoid number 1, lunate number 2, and triquetrum number 3, never pisiform. I'll come back to that when we do carpals in a couple of minutes. But the distal surface of the radius, always they have names and numbers. So it's easy to just say the first three carpals. But you're going to know scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, or carpals 1, 2, and 3. So the distal radius articulates with the first three carpals, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, to form radiocarpal, which is synonym for wrist joint. Radiocarpal and wrist joint are exactly the same. And what type of joint? Well, I'll ask you, what type of joint is the wrist joint of the 6?
Synovial ellipsoid.
Very good, yes, ellipsoidal. Yeah, there's another name, old-fashioned name, condyloid's not on the test. They're going to call this ellipsoidal. So the wrist joint is ellipsoidal, and all ellipsoidal joints, if they say what type of joint is the wrist joint, or what's the biaxial joint, the most famous biaxial joint any ellipsoidal joint. It's the only of the 6 categories, the only one of the 6 categories of synovial that's biaxial. And so the wrist is both ellipsoidal, structure-wise and function-wise. It's biaxial because it flexes, extends, and adducts, abducts. So it's between distal radius and first 3 carpals, ellipsoidal, biaxial. Wrist joint. And let's see, oh yeah, ulnar notch of radius. This notch may be a little hard to see. The notch pivots around, a notch is always a concave surface, and a fossa is always a concave surface. There's a technical difference, but it's not built into the naming actually. So just know they're both concave features. A fossa is always concave, a notch is always concave. The function of both is variable depending which notch, which fossa. But the notches in the forearm and wrist and elbow area are all articular. All of these notches are articular. Whereas on the sternum, actually most of the notches are articular, only the jugular is not, just jumping ahead. But all the other notches of the sternum actually are articular. So, but in any event, this ulnar notch of the radius pivots or articulates with the head of the ulna. So the ulnar notch of the radius is articular. It forms the distal radial-ulnar joint, which is a pivot joint. So that's the third articular feature, head, distal concave articular surface, or they might just say distal radius. They mean the same thing. If they say the distal epiphysis or the distal end of the radius, they mean this. I don't think it's going to be a test issue. They're just going to say radius articulates with which carpals, something like that, and it's 1, 2, and 3. And then ulnar notch of the radius. So those are the 3 articular features. Everything else is muscle attachment. And so I'm going to ask you one of these proximal epiphysis questions. Which of these features of radius are located on the proximal epiphysis? A, head, B, neck, C, radial or bicipital tuberosity, D, all of them, E, A, and B only. Which are on the proximal epiphysis? All of them. Head, neck, bump. It's a little like the rib. The rib ends with head, neck, bump. But I shouldn't have said that. A lot of long bones start with head, neck, bump. Proximally. The femur does, the radius does, the ulna doesn't. But so basically head, neck, bump. The radial tuberosity is this very large bump. So all of them are proximal epiphysis. And the 3 distal epiphysis features, styloid process radius like styloid ulna is distal but not articular. Distal concave articular surface, and the ulnar notch of the radius. Those are distal epiphysis. Okay. Now, for the carpals, here's what you need to know. Know which are, and I'm going to go through it right now. Know which of them are proximal epiphysis. Which of them are the proximal row, and 4, and which 4 are the distal row. I've seen that type of question. So the proximal row of carpals is simply scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform. 3 of them, the first 3 in the wrist joint. Proximal row of carpals, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum. Know that cold. That's more important than the distal row. So the proximal row, test-wise, maybe not function, but so scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform are the 4 proximal row carpals. And so if I have this question, all of the following carpals are in the wrist joint except, all of these carpals are in the wrist joint except A, scaphoid, B, pisiform, C, triquetrum, D, lunate. All are in the wrist joint except, someone said the name?
Pisiform.
Yeah, pisiform. I forgot the letter, but the first 3, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, know that cold in the wrist joint. Pisiform sits on this anterior triquetrum. It's that's why it's so palpable, but it's not in the wrist joint because it sits too far forward. So the first 3, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, wrist joint, pisiform, not. Now just be name familiarity, the distal row is trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. I would be aware of that. Now, you probably have the mnemonic, some lovers try positions, and that they can't handle for the distal row. Did you get that mnemonic?
Yes.
Okay, if that helps, use it. If not, any method that you know. It's easier to remember the proximal row because the first three, you gotta know they're in the wrist joint. Pisiform isn't. Then trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. Okay, now, just know generally they're distal row. But of those four, the one you really need to know, it's on every test question. The saddle joint of the thumb is formed by the base, or this is on all metacarpals, all phalanges, all metatarsals, hand and foot. So on tons of long bones, all 5 metacarpals, and then all 5 metatarsals, and all phalanges, whether hand or foot. I'll let you sign that later. You can just take a seat anyway. Okay, all of them, the proximal epiphysis is flatter, it's called the base. The distal epiphysis is rounder, it's called the head. Okay? Don't make people move if you come and move. You're sort of making people move. You can sit up here. Okay, so proximal epiphysis, base, on all of these bones, distal epiphysis, head. And so they might say base of first metacarpal articulates with which bone to form the saddle joint of the thumb. A, capitate, B, hamate, C, trapezoid, D, trapezium. They're really saying which carpal is in the saddle joint of the thumb. And the names, that's a hard question actually.
Can you say again?
Yeah, which of these carpals articulates with metacarpal 1 to form saddle joint of thumb? A, capitate, B, hamate, C, trapezoid, D, trapezium.
Cap is
Yeah,
the cap one.
yeah, trapezium. Know that code. One way or another, that's always on the final. It's on every test. You probably had it already. That the saddle joint, just know the 2 bones that form the saddle joint of the thumb that give the thumb its great mobility, that's a saddle joint obviously, is trapezium and first metacarpal. The saddle joint of the thumb is between trapezium and first metacarpal. Trapezium and first metacarpal. Okay, and basically that finishes everything except joint categories. So for all of these bones, they're not going to ask this type of question, but you have 14 phalanges in each hand. For the 4 fingers, 2, 3, 4, 5, you have proximal, middle, distal. This is not really going to be the question. Thumb only has proximal and distal. So it's 14 phalanges, all long bones, 5 metacarpals that we kind of covered. And just the joint categories, the radiocarpal or wrist is what type of joint? We did it like 5 minutes ago. What category synovial is the wrist joint? Good, ellipsoidal. Then all intercarpal are gliding. All intercarpal are just flat to flat gliding. And all, except for the saddle joint, which is special, so it's hard to ask this because you have one special case, but the other carpal, metacarpals are gliding. The others, you don't really see movement because it's slight, carpal, metacarpal gliding. Now, the names are blurry, so you might want to go to your hand. So the metacarpal, put it in question form. The metacarpal phalangeal joints, that means distal metacarpals and proximal phalanges. The metacarpal phalangeals are what type of joint? A gliding, B saddle, C hinge, D ellipsoidal. What type of joint are these? Ellipsoidal. That's a tricky category. The metacarpal phalangeals, including the thumb one. The saddle is here. This is not going to be an issue. This is actually just like the others, metacarpal phalangeal. All of them are ellipsoidal. All metacarpal phalangeal joints are biaxial. They can adduct, abduct, they can flex, extend. So all metacarpal phalangeal joints are ellipsoidal. And then whether, that's gonna be true in the foot too, metatarsal phalangeal. All interphalangeal joints, everywhere. That means it could be this one, it could be proximal, interphalangeal, could be the distal interphalangeal. All interphalangeal joints of the hand, I'll put it that way, all interphalangeal joints of the hand are A, gliding, B, ellipsoidal, C, hinge, D, anything. Yeah. For grasping, hinge is better than ellipsoidal for strong grasping, so, all interphalangeal joints, either hand or foot, both hand and foot, are hinges. All interphalangeal joints are hinges, and that's everything I need to do upper extremity. And there are quite a lot of questions upper extremity, but I covered everything. I just covered everything that you need to know.